I started a group called the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint about 3.5 years ago, and I started it in response to a situation that happened in my own family. I have a neurodivergent son who was being inappropriately restrained and secluded, and of course, that was a very traumatic experience for him. It was a traumatic experience for our family as well. After this happened to my son Cooper, I made a promise to him, and my promise was very simple, but it's one that has kind of changed my life in a lot of ways. And that promise was that I would do anything in my power to make sure that he wasn't again subjected to restrained seclusion. And I began doing a lot of research. I wanted to understand who this was happening to, why it was happening, what the impact was, and what we could do differently. And of course, the first thing that I learned was who was impacted by restrained seclusion. And of course, while restrained seclusion are intended to be crisis management interventions, we often find that it happens for far lesser things. We find that it happens for non-compliance, for disrespect, for minor behaviors. The who, though, is very clear. It's children with disabilities, Black and brown children, and children with a trauma history. So we know who's impacted by restrained seclusion. And of course, the data is pretty shaking. According to federal data, which is the best that we have, about 80% of restraints are children with disabilities, about 77% of seclusions. So when we talk about disproportionality, restraint and seclusion is certainly something that we see a very disproportionate impact on. The next question was, what's the impact? And what I found through the research that I was conducting, of course, was that it was trauma. Trauma to the kids being restrained and secluded, trauma to other kids that were witnessing it, trauma to teachers and staff. This is something that has a lot of impact, and kids can even develop post-traumatic stress disorder, as can staff as well. Of course, kids are injured, and unfortunately, children have even died being physically restrained in schools across the nation. The next thing I wanted to understand is what we could do differently. And this is where I first learned about the work of Dr. Ross Green. Lost at School was my first exposure. But what we did locally, our organization today advocates for these issues across the nation. But what we did locally initially was we advocated for change in our school district. We wanted to understand why this was happening and what we could do differently. And I worked with our Board of Education to change our policy and our practice regarding restrained seclusion. One of the first questions I was asked when I began to advocate for change was, what else do you expect us to do? And then I was given various scenarios. What should we do in this situation? And I'll be honest with you, the first time that question was asked of me, I didn't have a good answer. But that was the last time I didn't have a good answer. I went back and began doing a tremendous amount of research to understand who was being impacted and how we could do something differently. And of course, as I mentioned, that's when I found the work of people like Dr. Ross Green, Mona Delahook, Lori Desautel, a lot of people doing fantastic work around how to better support children, teachers, and staff. The year that my son was last restrained and secluded was in 2018. And at that point, a small district, we were about 14,000 kids. We had over 750 restraints and over 500 seclusions. Quite a bit. In fact, we were the highest in the state of Maryland when you looked against the enrollment of our counties. And we introduced 2 different training programs into the school in the fall of the following year, the fall of 2019. That included collaborative proactive solutions and something called UCARO. And after introducing those trainings over the course of the following 3 years, we saw the rate of restraint and seclusion drop dramatically. In fact, in the midpoint of the last school year, it was the last time I met with the school staff, we had only 10 restraints and 1 seclusion. So from hundreds and hundreds of restraints and seclusions down to less than a handful. So the hopeful message here, and what I'd like to just share with you before you get to listen to Dr. Green talk about his work in the collaborative proactive solutions approach, is that we can do better. I've always been a firm believer that if we can do better, we have an obligation to do so. And when it comes to restraint seclusion, there are better things that we can do to better support the students, the teachers, and the staff.